This is undoubtedly the most realistic wilderness survival show to date. Only 10 items are allowed per participant. 10 individuals from different industries are dropped on Vancouver Island to fend for themselves. The last one standing wins a $500,000 prize. The first contestant, Desmond, is dropped near a river, which solves any freshwater concerns. His priority is to find a suitable campsite. Before coming here, he boasted to friends and family that he would fight a black bear if encountered. As a veteran with 7 years of service, he felt confident. However, reality struck quickly when he soon found fresh bear droppings. He found even fresher bear droppings and froze in place. The second contestant, Larry, lands with a steep slope behind him. Carrying his gear, he finds a stream on the mountain and quickly sets up a makeshift shelter with a tarp over some branches, worried about having nowhere to sleep at night. He continues deeper into the forest, battling through dense bushes and heavy rain, finally finding a decent spot. He chops down a tree, sets up a frame, covers it with a tarp, and secures the edges with stakes, deciding to make it his temporary home until he finds a better location. At 36, Mary, compared to the first two contestants, quickly finds a flat spot in the wilderness. She constructs a humanoid frame with some logs and covers it with a tarp, quickly finishing her shelter. Meanwhile, Desmond is terrified by the black bears. Everywhere he goes, he sees their tracks. Hearing low growls from a bush nearby, he becomes paranoid and unsure of what to do. So he heads back to the beach to reflect on life, and eventually decides to call and quit the show, forgetting his bold statements at the start. The fourth contestant, Tracy, aims to set up a good shelter on her first day. She uses the old method of building with trees and tarps in the forest. Tracy is lucky. The beach below is full of mussels, enough to last her 6 months. Unfortunately, due to a red tide, all shellfish are inedible, and the show's crew would not be responsible for any resulting fatalities. On the second day, after a night of heavy rain, Mary's shelter faces severe water accumulation. The collected firewood is soaked. She is forced to reinforce her shelter to make it more stable and adds an extra green tarp on the ground. This way, even if water pools at the sides, the green tarp keeps her and the water separated like a boat. She then cuts notches in 2 trees, ties a horizontal beam, covers it with a tarp, and props up a wooden stick at the front to create a kitchen specifically for cooking. This showcases her adeptness at managing daily life. The next contestant, Justin, is also a veteran. He plans to find a spot in the jungle where food is abundant, hoping to sustain himself until he wins the challenge. Mike, nearly 60 years old, is much more pragmatic. Having spent 8 years teaching pilot survival skills behind enemy lines, he is an expert in living off the land. On the beach, he finds plenty of edible seaweed, especially a type of kelp that can grow 2 feet a day. Cooked, it becomes crispy, providing an important food source for survival. After collecting the seaweed, he quickly runs to the river mouth and sets up his fishing net. On the second day, Mike starts expanding his food sources. Facing several fresh piles of bear dung by the shore, he just smiles at the camera. It's unknown how long Justin had been in the jungle before he found a small stream. Approaching, he sees a dead duck by the stream with no bite marks or blood, suspecting it died from disease. Concerned about potential infection, he struggles briefly, but decides to throw the duck into the sea to avoid attracting bears. On the 5th day, Randy, another survival instructor, enters. He has already built a shelter and started a fire, brewing a cup of hemlock tea for vitamins early in the morning. Since he often hunts in the mountains with his family, he decides to ignore the sea's resources and sets traps for rabbits and mice in the jungle, using logs as weights to create a Paiute deadfall trap, known for its sensitive trigger. The next morning, Mike sees from a distance that his fishing net has caught something. A rockfish, visible on the water's surface, can grow up to 6 inches as an adult. Pulling up the net, he also finds a flounder and a carp, marking a fruitful day. He decides to roast one to satisfy his hunger, noting it tastes dozens of times better than beef. The remaining 2 are cooked and buried in a pit 100 meters away, extending their preservation and preventing bears from stealing them. In contrast, Randy is less fortunate. His traps were triggered, but he caught nothing. However, he is relieved to know there are animals in the area. The scene shifts to Mary, who has been feeling chilly at night. She decides to construct a door for her shelter, tying a log between 2 support posts and weaving fern leaves into it. She also makes a wooden tripod for support. After finishing, She crawls into her shelter, feeling warmer and safer. The next contestant, David, has a forbidding face but is a pastor. He has solved all survival essentials except for food. Earlier on the beach, he found some ropes and decided to hang his 4 fishing hooks from them, tying one end to a tree on the shore and throwing a stone tied to the other end into the sea, wondering if it will bring him a big meal tomorrow. The next morning, he checks but is disappointed. His dream was beautiful, but reality is harsh. He caught a bunch of seaweed and lost a hook. Randy had worse luck than David as he discovered his fire starter was missing. By reviewing yesterday's footage, he saw it had rolled into the fire pit and was completely burned to ash. As a wilderness survival instructor, he felt embarrassed to go back without it. Determined, he decided to rely on starting a fire by friction. Even unluckier was Mary, who planned to chop some firewood to stoke the fire today. Unfortunately, she accidentally cut her hand with the axe, causing severe bleeding, and reluctantly chose to withdraw from the competition. The scene returns to Randy, who prepared a bow drill fire-starting kit and began his challenging journey to make fire. From 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, he finally managed to create a small spark and lit the fire. He thought about the constant need to maintain it, feeling very disheartened. The 9th contestant to appear was Nicole, who had worked with the Bushmen in Africa and had some basic survival skills. The last to appear was Joseph, who had learned many survival skills from Native Americans. He was preparing to make a bellows. He dug up some spruce roots, scraped off the bark, soaked them in water, split a log in half, hollowed it out, made a small outlet at the end to create pressure, and tied it up with spruce roots. His simple bellows worked quite well. Tracy was planning to use a net to catch fish at the beach. She had not caught anything by hand before, and remembered she had a net just as she was getting very hungry. To prevent the net from being damaged by sharp rocks on the ground, she rolled it around a branch and set it in shallow water before the tide came in. Meanwhile, Nicole, busy filling gaps in her shelter with branches, suddenly heard roaring from the beach. She walked over and saw a black bear on the opposite riverbank, very far away, so she wasn't too scared. Calmly eating sea asparagus she had gathered, she crunched it, rich in various trace elements and vitamins A, B, C, D, E, F, G. After a tide cycle, Tracy checked her net and found a crab and a fish, delighted after 7 days without meat. She cleaned them and cooked them by the fire. The fish was delicious, and the crab was incredibly fresh. Her body, starved of protein, was greatly satisfied. She thought her size could sustain her for at least 20 days. However, that evening, 2 black bears invaded Tracy's camp. She grabbed a bear deterrent whistle and blew it loudly, but the bears were undeterred. She then lit a flare and chased the mother and cub out of the camp. Safe at last, Tracy broke down in tears. As a police officer, she disliked showing her aggressive side, felt bad about using violence, and was guilty about how she had treated the bear cub. Not wanting to see her aggressive side again, she decided to call the show's producers to withdraw. 3 contestants had already withdrawn. On day 8, Mike woke up from a dream where he thought he was embracing his wife, only to find a slug on his lip, almost giving him a psychological scare. After complaining, he planned to build a drying rack at the camp using 4 branches to form a square base and 2 sticks as lock foot poles, arranging 3 different thicknesses of wood on top for drying effects when lighting a fire beneath. David hadn't had a decent meal in 7 days, with thoughts of fried chicken and burgers dominating his mind. The crab supply in the nearby rock piles was already depleted, and his set spike net had caught nothing, making him wonder how he would survive the days ahead. Meanwhile, retired veteran Justin, still in high spirits, managed to catch a ratfish with a spike net modified from a hammock, a surprising gain that could provide 30 to 40 grams of protein. Back to Mike, tired of making fires on the ground, he reinforced the 4 stakes, placed a wooden board as a platform, and covered it with pebbles to separate the fire, creating a stove perfect for boiling fish soup. Using the lever principle, he made a faucet from a plastic bottle and ropes found at the beach. Stepping on a pedal would make the bottle bend and pour out water, showcasing his knack for making things. Larry, having seen traces of bears in the forest and not wanting to face one unarmed, decided to make a spear. He cut several forks at one end, inserted a stick to widen the gap, and sharpened the tips, creating a tool that could serve as both a spear and a fish spear. Hungry David decided to make another spike net using ropes he found, breaking them into threads and making a net shuttle from cedar wood. Relying on skills taught by his fisherman father years ago, he spent 2.5 hours weaving half of a net, needing more rope to complete it. Back to Larry, who hadn't eaten meat for several days, couldn't wait for the tide to recede to check his net. He rushed to retrieve the fish for soup, but it escaped when lifted, frustrating him to the point of nearly cursing, and he struggled with whether to quit the competition. Another day passed, and female contestant Nicole, surviving on collected clams, seaweed, crabs, mushrooms, bananas, and slugs, today she finally remembered to set her spike net during the rising tide, placing the net as the water almost overflowed her rain boots, hoping for a good catch the next day. David, unable to catch any fish, relied on drinking boiled water when hungry. Cedar bark burns fast, but spruce resin burns slow and is less flammable. Mixing the two, he managed to make a fire for boiling water and accidentally drying his freshly washed socks. Just as the water was about to boil, David accidentally knocked over the pot, immediately losing his temper. Larry finally had some luck. His spike net caught a half-pound algae base. Fearing it might escape like last time, he immediately smashed the fish with 2 blows in the water. Today, his 2 spike nets brought in 4 fish in total, lifting his spirits immensely. That evening, he savored tender and flavorful fish fillets, which contained dozens of times more protein than beef. He planned to cook the leftover fish bones into a soup the next morning. Nicole, excited, went to check her spike net and suddenly saw 3 black bears across the river. Thinking a few shouts might keep them at bay, she was alarmed when the mother bear stood and looked her way, causing Nicole to run back in panic. Justin was the least focused on survival tasks. While others struggled to secure protein, he was leisurely swinging on a swing. David's bad luck continued. His spike net was empty due to a loose stake and ended up tangled. Feeling on the verge of a breakdown, he remembered his 3 children at home. Limited by his financial abilities, he had often denied their requests, feeling deeply indebted to them. Determined, he resolved to endure no matter how difficult the circumstances. After being scared by the bears, Nicole checked her spike nets again the next morning. Perhaps touched by her optimistic spirit, she caught a large 7 to 8 pound mahi-mahi. Delighted by such a protein-rich catch, she beheaded the fish right there. This catch would suffice for at least 2 days. To avoid attracting bears to her shelter, Nicole cleaned the fish by the river, gutting and filleting it efficiently. Back at camp, she fried it until golden on both sides, and after waiting 10 minutes, it was perfectly cooked. Enjoying the hot protein, she exclaimed, "Oh my God!" She also roasted the fish bones to save for dinner. Justin remained eccentric, either swinging or exercising with found trash, rarely having a full meal. David, seeing fish in the seaweed, decided to make his own fishing gear since the spike net was ineffective. Using sea snails as bait, he tried his luck at fishing. His patience paid off when he caught a rockfish after half an hour, instantly lifting his spirits. Unable to wait to catch more, David cleaned the fish and boiled it in a pot for 5 minutes, creating a delicious fish soup that he eagerly devoured. After losing his fire starter, Randy's mood finally improved. Not wanting to sit idle, he decided to renovate his shelter. Using 2 wooden stakes tied at the top and filling the gaps with chopped logs, he built an enlarged lean-to with a tarp roof. Nicole, well-fed and sensing an impending storm, used the frame to measure the door size and tied wooden boards to create a door. She filled the gaps around the shelter with branches to keep warm. Justin used a piece of split kelp to extend outside the door, allowing him to urinate from inside the cabin. When the winds calmed a bit in the afternoon, Joseph went to clean his spike net covered in seaweed, working from day to night. Eventually, he found a fish weighing about 2.5 pounds in the net, rewarding his hours of effort with a delicious stew. The next morning, after the storm had fully passed, Randy went out to check his traps. The bait in the first trap was gone, but the mechanism hadn't been triggered. The second trap, however, did not disappoint, crushing a month-old Jerry. He took it back, skinned it, cleaned the insides, and roasted it. It was his first bite of protein in over 10 days, small but significant. On day 15, Mike wandered near the camp and spotted a plastic box on the beach. Except for the removable top, the rest of the box was watertight. An ingenious idea formed in his mind. After expending energy, he brought the box back to camp, sawed 2 pieces of wood, and attached them as outriggers to the sides of the box. Once in the water, The buoyancy was enough to support Mike, and he could now cast nets in deeper waters. Meanwhile, Larry was troubled by a mouse that had gotten into his shelter, disturbing his sleep. Fortunately, his spike net still caught several fish each day, but the damp tinder was difficult to light until he dozed off around 2:30 a.m., cursing in frustration. Contestants Joseph and Mike figured that a large river in the opposite valley would have salmon spawning in large numbers. Building a boat to cross the river and cast nets there would likely lead to success. However, Joseph couldn't find a plastic box on the beach like Mike, so he had to build a boat by hand, a process full of ups and downs. Just as he was ready to install the first crossbeam, the bottom of the boat snapped. Larry, similarly troubled by the mouse, swore to level the place if it damaged his sleeping bag. The luckiest contestant was Nicole. The black bear family across the river never approached her, and her spike nets almost daily caught increasingly larger fish. She discarded the heads and cut the rest into slices that filled her frying pan, enough to sustain her for 2 days in the shelter. Larry, disturbed by a mouse in his cramped shelter, decided to pack up and relocate. He set off southward, into unexplored territory, following a creek he found in the mountains. After hours of trekking, the landscape opened up to a flat woodland bordered by a wide coast. The area, littered with plenty of dry tinder and scattered chicken of the woods mushrooms, seemed like paradise compared to before. Walking along the beach, he found a rope, perfect for building a shelter. He tied a crossbeam between 2 trees, supported the canvas with 2 mannequins, and struggled with the rope when securing the support beams due to repeatedly cutting the logs too short, which frustrated him greatly. Meanwhile, Randy, fishing with lines he set up, caught a silver shark, a species closely related to sharks millions of years ago. His luck continued with 2 successful catches, filling him but also deepening his sense of loneliness. Nicole, guarding a pot of fish stew and thinking of her late foster child, felt similarly. To combat the loneliness, Randy kept busy by reinforcing the shelter with additional support poles, improving his bed with fern leaves and a tarp, and finally, lying down in his sleeping bag, feeling extremely comfortable. By day 19 at 2:30 a.m., Justin discovered his shelter flooded, his sleeping bag soaked because he had set up in a swamp. The recent continuous rain had raised the groundwater level, turning his fire pit into a water pit, leaving him utterly distraught. He carried his sleeping bag to the kitchen at dawn, hoping to dry it with his body heat and the fire. Larry, having settled into his new home, was in high spirits surrounded by abundant chicken of the woods. However, he was uncertain about his net's catch. If he could catch some fish, the place would be perfect, but both his nets came up empty. Resigned, he cooked a meal with cap shells and mushrooms, managing a decent meal. The next morning, Larry was putting out a fire. He had made a fire under a large tree root, which had hollowed out the tree while he slept. Fortunately, the damp, rainy climate prevented a forest fire. Joseph's boat building progressed, with the gunnels and crossbeams in place. Next, he installed the ribs, choosing cedar wood, meticulously sanding it to the right dimensions. He sprinkled water on the areas needing bending and used the heat from a fire to bend them, installing over a dozen ribs in total. David had the worst luck of all. His gill net hadn't caught a single fish so far. Desperate with hunger, he relied solely on limpets for protein, though they contained very little meat. He had to eat a large quantity every day to satisfy his hunger. Eventually, David completed weaving his fishing net. To increase his chances of catching fish, he connected 2 nets together and hung lots of chunks of meat on them. He joked that if he still couldn't catch any fish, there must be something wrong with the feng shui at his home. Justin's net, initially a repurposed hammock, had also failed to catch any fish. He decided to revert it back to its original function, securing it with crossbeams and ropes at both ends. Despite the seaweed smell, sleeping on it was quite comfortable. Mike focused on his mental well-being. He crafted 2 dice from wood and used shells and stones as playing pieces, playing soccer games in his shelter and snacking on seaweed occasionally. Over the past few days, he made a bow and arrow, an alpaca trap, and used a found buoy as a bowling ball, entertaining himself on the beach. The days without worrying about food made him miss his wife at home even more, feeling that survival in the wild was just a repetition of the same tasks, which he found exceedingly dull. Consequently, Mike made a call to withdraw from the competition, proving that being lovesick is not conducive to making money. Randy, feeling a deep longing for his family, decided to build a sweat lodge to cleanse his mind and body. He arranged 8 saplings in a circle on the ground, tied the top branches together, covered it with a tarp, and placed hot stones inside. He poured water on the stones to create steam, followed by a dip in the sea after his sauna session. Eventually, he too made the call to withdraw from the competition, defeated by the loneliness. On the 22nd day of the competition, David's gill net still had caught nothing. Meanwhile, a huge spruce log washed up next to his net. Not wanting the log to damage the net, he used the tide to drag it ashore. When he returned, another log floated by, leaving him utterly speechless. Joseph's boat was almost complete, only needing its hull to be covered with a tarp. He had recently found a seal bone on the beach, which, after a long soak, became flexible enough to be fashioned into a needle, perfect for sewing the tarp onto the frame. He first broke off a piece of bone, then continuously sanded one end to make the eye of the needle, which was a quick task. Since the tarp was very thin and easily torn by rocks and barnacles, Joseph sewed several protective planks onto the bottom of the boat. Everything was ready for the trial run. On the 22nd day, to honor 22 veterans who had taken their own lives, Justin decided to climb the mountain behind his shelter. Despite several falls and knee pain, he wanted to convey a never-give-up attitude to his fellow soldiers. He braved the risks, navigated through dense, difficult bush, and conquered the steep slopes to reach the summit. After returning, feeling completely rejuvenated, he quickly dismantled his damp shelter, moved the timber to a new site, cleaned the area, set up a triangular sloped roof frame, and hung his hammock on the crossbeam, completing a deluxe watchman's hut. It was time for Nicole to check her gill net again. Undoubtedly, she caught a salmon weighing about 7 or 8 pounds. She used her hunting knife to chop off its head on the spot and cleaned the guts out. Back at camp, she cooked a full pot of it and delighted in the meal. Eating fish all day had made her a bit tired of it, so she planned to find some vegetables nearby to add vitamins to her diet. Unexpectedly, she saw a pile of freshly eaten salmon by black bears across the river. Judging by the still bright red gills, the fish was very fresh. Any other contestant would have taken it. But Nicole, seemingly unaware of how to store food, continued into the woods along the river usually occupied by those bears. She spotted several spawning fish in the river, enough to smoke and store for 10 days to half a month. However, she just looked and left, instead gathering herbs and plantain grass from the meadow to eat with her fish. Other contestants would have been envious of her resources. In stark contrast was David, whose gill net caught nothing and was tangled by the waves. Suppressing his frustration, it took him hours to untangle and restore the net. Compared to Nicole, who never worried about food, David was extremely unlucky. The next day, a yellow cedar log floated in and tore a big hole in his net. Nicole's luck continued to shine, as her gill net caught another fish, surprising everyone since she hadn't finished yesterday's fish. Confident in her net, she released the fish. On day 31, 5 contestants remained. Early in the morning, David saw a mink running past with an eel in its mouth. He tried to scare it into dropping the food, but the mink ignored him. Faced with no catch from his gill net, Larry moved into his new house a few days ago. Annoying rats began to appear nearby again. This time, he decided not to avoid them. Using conch meat as bait, he set a Paiute trap next to the camp. Killing even one rat would add some protein to his diet. Joseph spent over 10 days building a boat. Today, he finally launched his Delicate Lady. However, just a few meters out, the shaky boat nearly capsized. Realizing the danger, he turned back to shore. Planning to add an outrigger, he used a plastic bottle and a buoy he found earlier. Securing them to sticks, he fixed them at the stern as an outrigger. The boat was much more stable when launched again. Excited, Joseph headed toward the opposite valley. But before he could get far, the boat started leaking. Delicate Lady lived up to its name. He paddled back quickly, found a hole in the bottom, and faced the tough task of patching it up. His plan to catch migrating fish was delayed. The scene shifts to David. Waking up early, he saw a cedar log at the beach where his gill net usually was. With no fish caught in over 30 days, he had no hopes for the net. Now he planned to try using mussels as bait for crab fishing. Surprisingly, he caught one immediately. Several crabs were visible on the shallow reef. Sometimes, luck is unstoppable. One crab after another, David caught 6 within 20 minutes. He cleaned them on the spot and cooked a full pot back at camp. Finally, he enjoyed a proper feast of delicious, tender crab meat, with protein content many times that of beef. Justin, after repurposing his fishing net into a hammock, turned his attention to the conchies by the seaside. While big prey was scarce, these conchies were plentiful. In no time, he collected nearly half a basin full. Back at camp, he boiled them in water for 3 minutes. The conch meat was chewy and tasty. That evening, Larry also had a good catch. His gill net captured a half-pound rockfish. Passing by a kelp, he picked up a crab, enough to fill his stomach for the night. He was even more delighted when his Paiute trap was triggered for the first time. At that moment, his mood was incredibly joyful. Back to Justin, with plenty of conches, he was neither full nor starving. Doing the same tasks daily, he felt his wilderness survival had turned into a routine factory line. The adventure and novelty he sought were gone after surviving more than a month. Soon, the production crew's boat appeared. On day 35, Justin chose to withdraw. With his departure, only 4 contestants remained. After mastering fishing skills, David experienced a turnaround. Today, during low tide, he cast his line and caught a rockfish within 10 minutes, erasing any prior frustration. Now, full of confidence in his skills, David quickly hooked a second fish, larger than the first. He strung the fish on a rope and placed them on the rocks, planning to catch another for a hearty stew. However, when he turned to collect them, they were gone. Despite searching, there was no trace. Annoyed, David concluded a bald eagle must have stolen them. Nicole, the luckiest so far, didn't realize her misfortune was looming. A leopard seal lurked near her fishing net. When she checked the net hours later, she found only half a fish had left. She had seen a large mahi-mahi enter the net during high tide and expected a feast, only to find the seal had beaten her to it. The next day, David resumed fishing. As expected, he quickly caught 2 rockfish. Wanting to diversify his meals, he prepared 1 fish, leaving only the head and spine, planning to use it to catch crabs. However, he accidentally threw out his line coil. Attempting to retrieve it, David slipped into the cold water, soaking his lower body. At his age, he knew it wasn't worth risking hypothermia over a stable food supply. He hurried back, stripped off his pants, and warmed up in his sleeping bag. After 2 days of repairs, Joseph finally fixed the hole in his boat. On his 3rd outing with the delicate lady, he reached the opposite valley's riverside, seeing many seagulls and eagles, a good sign of fish presence. Walking upstream, he only found scattered salmon remains and no fish. Realizing he might have missed the salmon run, his mood plummeted. Larry, managing with just enough food and drink, considered how to pass the time. He picked a piece of wood and worked on it for 2.5 hours with his survival knife, crafting a decent wooden spoon. He tested it during dinner, stirring the pot of mussels and seaweed, and was pleased with the result. Since Nicole's encounter with the leopard seal, her quality of life has plummeted. Today, when checking her fishing net, she found not only that fish were stolen, but also a large hole in the net. Unsure what to do, she reluctantly moved the net upstream to avoid the seal. Although Joseph missed the salmon season, he could still go deep-sea fishing. Using methods he learned from the Inuit, he found a curved tree branch in the woods, brought it back, and worked on peeling, sanding, and polishing it. Later, he took the delicate lady out to deeper waters. After waiting for an unknown amount of time, he actually caught a large-headed fish. Despite its ugly appearance, it provided substantial energy. If fishing could always be this successful, then his efforts on the boat would not be in vain. Larry's situation now resembles Justin's before he withdrew from the competition. Every day, he does the same few things: chopping wood, starting a fire, boiling water, cooking, checking fishing nets and lines, handling the catch, drinking spruce tea at dusk while watching the sea, staring into the dark for 3 to 4 hours, and finally crawling into his sleeping bag to sleep. By the 50th day, Larry was nearly driven mad by the monotonous and isolated life, but he must continue to endure for the $500,000 prize. Nicole's luck has completely run out since the seal encounter, and her net has not caught any fish. Starving, she decides to venture into black bear territory to see if she can find any leftovers. The next day, the temperature drops suddenly, possibly indicating the approach of winter. Joseph makes a fishing reel. Once the line is set, one can just wait to collect the catch. As Joseph returns to the shore to set a second line, he spots a plastic bucket on the beach. That evening, he goes to move it to his shelter but turns it over and sees it covered in a large number of mussels. Although the crew warned that bivalves in this region might be infected due to red tide and are unsafe to eat, risking severe health issues, Joseph, driven by hunger, ignores the warnings. Today, with no catch on his lines, he gathers the mussels, cooks a full pot, and eats it all, enjoying the chewy, lip-smacking flavor, as delicious as any beef. Fortunately, the mussels were not infected, and after a night's sleep, he shows no adverse reactions. David, who suffered hunger for a month earlier, now finds a rock pool and uses his increasingly proficient fishing skills to effortlessly catch 4 crabs. He processes 2 on the spot, more than he can hold in his hands. Day 52 of the challenge. Today is Nicole's youngest son's birthday. For the first time in many years, she's missing her child's birthday. The survival days must go on. As expected, her fishing net caught nothing. Previously, she could find plantain and grass to eat nearby. Recently, due to the sudden drop in temperature, the plants have all frozen to death. She's reached the point where there is no grass to eat. Racking her brain, she thought of looking for mushrooms in the forest. Unfortunately, all she could find were either poisonous or inedible polypores. She found some horsetail, suitable only for cleaning teeth and scrubbing cookware. After searching the bushes for a long time, she found a single red berry. Without hesitation, she quickly picked and ate it. Generally, berries appear in clusters, so a single berry suggests that a black bear had been there. Nicole quickly returned to the shore and eventually resorted to cooking mussels. Boiling them in water, they could still be eaten a few times, though the energy they provided was pitifully little. At this stage of the challenge, the contestant's mental resilience is crucial. Whenever David has downtime, he misses his 3 children. To keep himself busy, he cuts some sap from a cedar tree and heats it in a shell until it melts. He then absorbs it into the soft tree bark fibers, creating a flammable tinder. This small amount is enough for David to use for half a month. Recently, Larry's condition has visibly deteriorated, not only due to the monotony and missing his family, but also due to the severe lack of food. After finally catching a rat in his trap, he says he will eat it as if licking an ice cream due to concerns about potential parasites. Day 56 of the challenge. Even the usually stable Joseph felt sentimental. The champion of the first season, Alan, won on this day. But for Joseph, in his second season of isolation in the wilderness near the sheltered bay, he can sustain himself but wonders how long he must endure before seeing his wife again. The next day at noon, the crew's speedboat appears again. Which contestant will withdraw this time? The camera focuses on Nicole. The reason is simple: food depletion and missing her family. She may not be an excellent survivalist, but she is certainly a kind woman. Day 57 of the challenge. 3 contestants remain. While beachcombing, David finds a nail, which he slightly modifies to create a weapon. Next time he sees a black bear, he won't have to flee in panic. Its main use is to pry mussels off rocks conveniently. Just aim at the edges and stab. With calm seas and good weather, David sits among the rocks and fishes. While he can't expect a catch within minutes, he never returns empty-handed when he casts his line. Today, he catches the largest rockfish since the challenge began. A real morale booster for him. After an unknown amount of time, another wild fish bites. It must be said that David has truly transformed. Previously starving, he used to eat kelp to stave off hunger, but now he manages to catch fish or crabs daily, stewing them in an iron pot by the fire. This method retains the nutrients in the fish far better than grilling. Larry, competing under the worst conditions, has set traps that haven't caught the 3 or 4 rats he hoped for in several days. Unbeknownst to him, rats avoid traps that smell of death from their own kind. His fishing net is even more disheartening, failing to catch fish and barely touching any seaweed. With winter approaching, the fish have moved to warmer, deeper waters, so his attempts at fishing day and night yield nothing. Disheartened, Larry decides to retrieve his fishing net, regretting not heeding his son's advice to exchange it for a compound bow, which could have made local seabirds and ducks a good food source. Now he must satisfy his hunger with just a few hatshell snails and periwinkles. Joseph, in better circumstances, occasionally watches the sea otters in the water to pass the time. Thanks to a pulley system he installed on his net, he can check his catch from the shore. This time, he has caught 2 Irish kings, which he cleans thoroughly and brings back to camp to stew with hat shells and seaweed, savoring every bit of the delicious meal, not wasting even the broth or bits. As a Spaniard currently unable to work in Canada, relying financially on his wife, he is eager to use the prize money to regain confidence and share his wife's burdens. Larry, from hunger, dreams of eating fried chicken even in his sleep. His mood suddenly becomes uncontrollable while chopping wood during the day. But just when you think he can't go on, he pulls himself together mentally. Despite cursing from start to finish, he refuses to quit. The scene returns to David, who, after a satisfying meal, dries his washed socks the next day, and then heads to the beach to fish. Undoubtedly, he catches another bass. He casts again, when suddenly the fish on the line escapes the hook. David dives to catch it, narrowly preventing its escape. However, whenever he has a moment to himself, he misses his children, a feeling no better than hunger. Since enjoying that pot of fish soup, Joseph's days have also become challenging. He planned to row to deeper waters to fish, but sudden strong winds and waves thwarted his plans. Forced to stay in his shelter, he eats the little remaining provisions. Once the storm passes, he plans to check his fishing net, but in his eagerness, he pulls out the stake that was anchoring the net. With the water levels high in recent days, it's impossible to go down and secure the stake again. After returning, Joseph wrapped a piece of plastic in a tarp to make a buoy. He tied the buoy and rocks to both sides of the fishing net so he could secure the net without entering the water. The next morning, aboard the Delicate, he decided to act immediately. As he narrated his determination to persevere for his wife while laying the net, the balance of the boat was disrupted by the weight of a rock and his shifting position, causing the Delicate to capsize and throw Joseph into the sea. Struggling to stand, his clothes were soaked by the icy water. To make matters worse, he wore all his warm clothes with no spare dry ones left, forcing him to press the withdrawal button. He was one of the most emotionally stable competitors, and could have rivaled the fishing expert David, if not for this mishap. Now, he exits the competition with regrets towards his wife. After suffering from hunger, Larry considered giving up, planning to burn all his firewood and eat the remaining hat shells and winkles before quitting. Perhaps a pot of stew restored some energy, reigniting his desire to win for himself and his family. He tied 4 fish hooks to his fishing line, connecting foam and rocks to both ends, and threw it into the sea to see the results. He also fixed a net on top of a rock pile, hanging some winkle meat on it to attract seabirds that might get tangled while eating. Larry felt that as long as he didn't contemplate the conditions for exit, he could last a few more weeks here. Meanwhile, David's mental defenses were weakening. The isolation was unbearable, and food was scarce. Any pause would lead to hunger. One evening, when a fish slipped off the hook, David tried to catch it but accidentally injured his knee. Such an injury might be minor for the young, but for a man over 50 and undernourished, it could lead to withdrawal. He had to rest again. Larry, having set traps in the sea, land, and air, just needed to wait at the camp for prey. Recalling his journey from initial excitement to overcoming environmental challenges and finally finding a perfect spot to survive, he was not ready to quit and waste all his efforts. On day 64, Larry was so hungry he felt nauseous. David, having stayed indoors for days, wasn't faring any better with unbearable pain in his shoulders and knees. Both clung to their last ounce of faith and reason, urging themselves to hold on a little longer. As the camera crew's speedboat entered the scene, it was clear someone had withdrawn from the competition. But who could it be? The camera shifted to Larry, who couldn't help but cry upon seeing other people again. He had exhausted his body's last reserves of energy and had no choice but to withdraw. Unaware of his victory, David continued to fish for food from the sea to feed his hungry stomach. The crew, pretending to conduct a routine medical check, questioned him. David expressed his determination to continue as long as he could rely on fish and crabs, and as long as his competitors stayed in the game. At that moment, David's daughter Erin was quietly brought in by the crew and approached him from behind. When he turned and saw her, tears immediately flowed. David's most memorable words were, "If I give up now on this chance to change my children's fate, I could never forgive myself. As long as I don't quit the competition, I'm willing to do whatever it takes." These few sentences encapsulated a father's profound love for his children. Let's congratulate David on becoming the champion of the competition. The production team selected 10 top wilderness survival experts and deployed them to the Arctic region of Canada. Whoever lasts 100 days will win a $1 million prize. As the helicopter departed, each contestant was delivered to their drop-off point. The first contestant introduced was Sean, who had gained 3 million followers online through his survival videos. A devoted fan of solo wilderness living, he had spent the past 2.5 years honing his skills, building shelters, and making tools, all in preparation for this challenge. Upon finding a toolbox the crew had placed a day earlier, Sean noticed several bear paw prints on it and thought, "I can't confront it, but I can certainly avoid it." With his gear, he moved away from this ominous area. Having settled in a new location, Sean quickly assembled his bow and arrows and went to scout the nearby area. Overcome with excitement, he suddenly spotted something, held his breath, and shot an arrow. A dark shape fell from a tree. It was a porcupine. Within half an hour of landing, Sean had secured a substantial amount of protein. He cleaned it by the lake, made a roasting rack out of branches, and slow-cooked the torso for hours. However, the dry grass and wood in the Arctic were somewhat damp, and it took Sean several minutes to get the fire going. He stewed the 4 large legs in a pot, and the taste was better than expected, making him hum in satisfaction to the camera. The second contestant, Joe, a biologist from the National Park Service, was also adept with plants and animals, and skilled in making traps and starting fires by friction. Like Sean, he explored his surroundings upon landing. Attracted by chattering squirrels in the trees, Joe, who had not brought a bow and arrow but was proficient in baseball, threw stones at the squirrels, attempting to knock them down. Like everyone else, I doubted his chances. Surprisingly, he managed to kill a squirrel with a stone, proving the contestant's exceptional skills this season. That evening, Sean heard something tampering with his iron pot outside the camp. It was likely a bear or a wolf. Armed with his bow and arrows, he bravely went to check. The visitor was scared away, but the pot had indeed been tampered with. After this incident, Sean was too nervous to sleep. On the second day of the challenge, female contestant Kaylin was still figuring out the local wildlife. To be safe, she set up 7 rope traps. Along the way, she found some spruce resin, and remembering that Native Americans chew it, she tried it out of curiosity. 3 seconds later, she couldn't spit it out fast enough due to its terrible taste. Guessing the area was rich in resources, she had set the traps only 2 hours before noon and already caught a rabbit. Kaylin cried holding the dead rabbit, but returned to the camp to cook it with mushrooms, finding some solace in her meal. The next contestant is Roland, a licensed hunting guide in Alaska who lives a semi-modern, self-sufficient life. He frankly stated that he would have to be dragged away from the contest for the $1 million prize. Early in the morning, he started a fire to smoke out black ants hidden in the wood. Believing that even mosquitoes are meat, he pinched each ant and ate them. Afterward, he went out to look for game traces, but stumbled upon a large spool of fishing line. Thinking of making a fish hook to add to his gear, he walked to the lake to find a fishing spot. Unexpectedly, a wolverine scurried out from under a rock. Roland then cheerfully took out his battle axe, ready to confront the wolverine if necessary. The scene switched back to Joe. Perhaps feeling lightheaded from eating squirrel, he foolishly decided to bathe in 3-degree water, immediately regretting it and hurriedly getting dressed. He collected several scarlet fungi nearby, planning to stew them with meat. While exploring the bushes and noticing numerous animal tracks, he hadn't decided how to set traps when he spotted a black bear about 100 meters away. Lacking both a bow and a battle axe, anyone else might have fled, but Joe decided to confront the bear and drive it away from his camp. Thanks to his experience at the National Park Service, he managed to scare the bear away after about 10 minutes. Having eaten rabbit stewed with mushrooms, Kaylin used her energy to build a winter shelter. Initially planning for a luxurious tent, she considered her solo status and opted for a simpler, classic A-frame design. She used logs for walls, stuffed moss into the gaps, and left a large entrance. She covered the roof with a tarp and additional branches, creating a durable, wear-resistant wooden hut. Sitting inside eating stewed meat, her life seemed quite comfortable compared to Joe, who was still living in a makeshift shelter. After driving away the black bear yesterday, he set several traps in the bushes. This morning, he checked the traps, hoping for just 500 calories a day. Unfortunately, his skills did not allow for much, but as he entered the bushes, he saw a rabbit caught in a trap. Just as Joe was overjoyed, he noticed another trap had also caught a rabbit. Now, he had 2 rabbits to satisfy his desire to stew meat with scarlet fungi. On the 10th day of the challenge, Sean had completed 30% of his winter shelter. It seemed like he was settling down for the long haul. In his downtime, he entertained himself and the camera crew. The porcupine he had previously caught was already eaten. Today, he planned to quickly find more food to keep up with the construction of his shelter. Lucky for him, just a few hundred meters out, he found an abandoned boat under some broken branches. However, his luck turned when he returned to camp to start a fire and realized he couldn't find his fire starter. After searching his previous clothes and not finding it, he thought it might have dropped on his way back to camp. He retraced his steps for over 3 hours. As happy as he was before, he was now equally distressed. Starting a fire by friction wasn't his forte, especially with everything slightly damp. Facing the prospect of the Arctic winter without fire, Sean reluctantly made the call to withdraw from the competition. Rewinding to day 5, Roland was busy harvesting various berries from the grassland. He seasoned them in his boots before storing them in hollow tree trunks. Over the past few days, he filled 5 such trunks with berries. Building his winter shelter also became a priority. He found a large pile of rocks and planned to use them to construct a stone house. Building walls from scattered stones, some weighing up to 180 kilograms, was not an easy task. Fortunately, Roland was strong. Although the construction was laborious, the rock walls would reflect the heat from the fire, making his stone house the warmest among the contestants. After 2 days, he finished the walls and chimney, stuffing moss into the gaps. Next, he built the roof, choosing thick spruce trees for the task. Each processed log weighed nearly 200 kilograms, a testament to his ambitious efforts. After setting up the roof's base, the rest was relatively easy. The scene shifts to the 5th contestant, Mark, who served in the U.S. Army for 10 years. 2 years ago, he started teaching courses on shooting, survival, mountaineering, and tracking. Mark, skilled in various survival techniques, joined the competition to save money for his 1-year-old son's baby formula. While other contestants focused on hunting land animals, Mark had already set up his fishing nets early. He caught more fish than expected today. 4 in total, 2 lake trout, and 2 whitefish. Now, only the main door of his shelter remained to be built. His immediate task was to process these fish. Mark built a semicircular stone hearth inside his house, with 3 stone slabs protruding in the middle as a cooking surface. He filleted the fish, removed the heads, and cut them into small pieces to be dehydrated on the smoke rack above the hearth, providing enough food for the next several days. The next contestant to appear is a woman named Crawley. She spent most of her adulthood outdoors, mastering all survival skills. Hunting animals and processing their hides are routine for her. She started by setting snares for rabbits in the bushes and gradually familiarized herself with larger animals and fish. One day, while hunting with her bow and arrow, Crawley spotted a pack of wolves in the bushes ahead. She was excited and decided to follow them to see what was happening. As expected, she quickly lost sight of them. Whether Crawley's hunting skills are good remains unknown, but she certainly isn't less courageous than the male contestants. The camera then cuts to the 7th contestant, Corey, who made a spectacular debut by shooting a squirrel with his arrow. Born into a family of hunters and gatherers, he has been handling bows and arrows since childhood. He joined the competition to win the prize money and live a free life. So far, he has built most of the framework of his house and a 3-layer log bed. Next, he plans to use logs to build walls on both sides, sawing off the excess and filling the gaps with moss. His craftsmanship is both exquisite and beautiful. Unfortunately, while carrying wood back to camp, he slipped and fell, hearing a dull sound in his left knee, which had undergone surgery 13 years ago. Despite the pain, tempted by the $1 million prize, he decided to endure it and see if it would heal in the next few days. Today, he finished the sides of the wooden hut, covered it with a tarp, and laid a thick layer of branches, declaring it complete. The 8th contestant, Amos, learned wilderness survival as a child to avoid war. Now 40, he is skilled in many areas, including making traps, fire by friction, building shelters, and identifying edible plants. Like Mark, he also set up fishing nets early. At the lake, He found a 3 to 4 pound burbo in his net, enough to feed him for 2 days. While cleaning the fish, a wolf, attracted by the smell, came close but wisely walked away due to the size difference. On the 9th day, Mark, having caught 4 fish in one net, has been enjoying several pots of fish head soup these days. He can't afford to waste the fatty fish ice as he needs it to maintain his weight. Now, only the main door of his shelter remains to be built. He grouped 4 logs, securing horizontal supports at the top and bottom, with a layer of spruce branches sandwiched between 2 wooden planks, creating his door. After finishing, he wanted to rest, but was disturbed by the cawing of crows outside. Years of wilderness experience told Mark that there might be a predator nearby. He went outside and saw a black bear roaming around the camp, likely attracted by the smell of smoked fish. He quietly followed the bear downwind, hoping to follow it back to its den and kill it for meat that could last him 2 months. Unfortunately, by 3:30 p.m., the bear had vanished. Mark then mimicked the distress call of a rabbit to try and lure the bear. After waiting half an hour without seeing the bear, he returned to camp. Corey, having caught no significant prey, quickly crafted a fishing net from parachute cord to improve his diet. By day 10, he needed to add notches to his belt to tighten his pants. Without substantial food, he risked being removed from the show. Despite daily hunting trips with his bow and arrow, he saw no rabbits nearby. His hopes now rested on the makeshift net. Fortunately, it paid off, catching a fish weighing 2.5 pounds, enough for a hearty meal. He rushed back to cook it, patiently waiting 15 minutes before enjoying the steaming fish. Corey also focused on a balanced diet, eating berries daily for vitamins. His only concern was the pain from a knee injury days earlier, which had worsened. He felt a large, fluid-filled sac in his knee, indicating a recurrence of an old injury. That night, he felt feverish and struggled with sleep, the pain in his knee intensifying. Realizing his body's healing was insufficient, and with the competition far from over, he had no choice but to withdraw to recover. The scene shifts to Crawley. Her previous shelter was inadequate, so she found a better location to start anew. Before breaking ground, she needed to gather food. On a rocky hill, she heard something below and spotted a porcupine napping. Excitedly, she shot it with an arrow, followed by another to ensure it was dead. This catch, weighing about 10 pounds, ranked among the top 5 prey in the area. After spending minutes skinning and cleaning, Crawley had enough meat for the next few days to fuel her shelter building. The 9th contestant, Joel, grew up in South Africa and Tanzania, learning survival and hunting skills from the Maasai. He joined the competition for a better life for his family. By day 8, he had only caught a rabbit and a squirrel. Today he ventured further, finding fresh moose tracks in the bushes and a muskox skeleton on the ground, suggesting a good number of large animals in the area. He took the muskox skull back to camp as a totem, talking to it each morning to alleviate loneliness. While his bow hunting yielded little, his fishing net was more successful, catching a white fish weighing about 2.5 pounds today. Over the next 3 days, the net brought in 4 more fish. Joel wanted to build a food storage on a tree to avoid black bears and wolverines. He first made a ladder and chose 3 adjacent spruce trees. He cut off the obstructive lower branches and then climbed the ladder to trim the excess tree crowns. Unfortunately, a falling tree crown knocked him down unexpectedly. Luckily, he was not injured. Eventually, he built a platform on the 3 trees and stored smoked fish meat on it. The last contestant, Keith, has over 30 years of wilderness survival experience. Skilled in hunting, fishing, and setting traps, he joined the competition to win the prize money, quit his job, and spend more time enjoying the wilderness. Although he has been hunting daily, he has not seen any large game yet. Today, he finally found fresh moose droppings. After searching the forest for a while, he heard a squirrel chattering. Keith drew his bow and shot it, catching the falling squirrel with one hand. This smooth operation was impressive. He took it back, cleaned it, and saved the meat for dinner, using the innards as fish bait. He practices full utilization, wasting nothing. The scene switches to Kaylin, who found a metal fishing lure on the beach. Planning to try her luck at the lake near her shelter, she was not short on protein, having caught rabbits with snare traps. She wanted to fish to add some fats to her diet. Her fishing net had not caught anything since being placed in the water. Thinking the area was low in fish, Kaylin took a sleeping bag, an axe, and other equipment to a spot 1.6 kilometers away, believing the fishing chances were better there. After 2.5 hours, she finally got a fish on the line, but it escaped halfway through reeling it in. However, this confirmed that there were fish in the area. She camped there overnight and started fishing again at 8 a.m. the next day. By 10:30 a.m., she had given up on catching fish. As she was about to pack up, she spotted a 600-pound moose about 30 meters away. The moose, seeing her, quickly entered the lake, attempting to swim to the other side. Kaylin mimicked the call of an estrus female moose, successfully attracting its attention. Just as she was about to shoot it with her bow, she realized she had not brought her bow and arrow, leaving her completely frustrated. On the 11th day, Amos started his morning with Native American calisthenics, expressing gratitude for nature's gifts. He then checked his gill net, which had caught a northern pike today. Since the start, his fish supply had never run out, totaling 11 fish. He wasted nothing, using fish heads for soup and drying the meat for his main food. He hung the surplus on trees for storage, hoping to avoid bears and wolverines. If everything continued this way, he had a good chance of making it to 100 days. However, the inevitable still arrived. Just after Amos had finished a big meal, he heard animals moving outside his shelter. Taking his bow and arrow, he went out to see who it was. He saw a wolverine quickly running back into the forest. Seeing that the dried fish meat hanging from the tree was still there, he returned to his shelter satisfied and continued resting. Joe was in the worst situation. After eating the wild rabbit and squirrel he caught, he now relied solely on berries and mushrooms for food. His winter shelter had yet to be started. Being quite skinny, he wanted his shelter to be well built, so he even brought a chisel with him. He cleaned up a large tree, tied ropes around the top, and raised it using a human-shaped frame. He then inserted a crossbeam at the top with a dovetail joint and used mortise and tenon joints at the base. He installed 8 foot-locking poles between 2 human frames. Continuing the construction would take a lot of effort. By the 15th day, Joe started his morning with a series of lightning 5 whips exercises to stretch his muscles. He then went to check his traps, which had been empty for days. Disheartened and preparing to go back to chewing on berries, Joe saw a squirrel hiding in a hole. He grabbed a sharpened stick to try to kill it, but failed after struggling for a while. He planned to get a longer stick and try again. Unfortunately, he didn't block the hole, allowing the squirrel to escape. Probably a few days without meat had dulled his mind, leading to such a basic mistake. Back to Keith, he made himself a pair of earrings using berry juice and animal bones. Maintaining a positive attitude is crucial for survival. Now that he had the right mindset, he was just unsure about the outcome with his fishing line. But it didn't disappoint him. The fishing line caught a 2.5-pound plump lake fish with appetizing bright yellow flesh. He grilled the meat on a rack and saved the bones and head for making soup. The smoked dried fish, rich in protein, offered a distinct flavor. By the 14th day, Roland's trap finally caught a squirrel. Having not seen meat for days, he was overjoyed. After his meal, he still needed to complete the roofing of his stone house. He cut down 10 nearby trees and laid them flat to fit just right. Next, he stuffed moss into the gaps and covered them with a tarpaulin to finish the job. 2 days later, since he hadn't caught any game, Roland dug up a lot of irises. Not only are they medicinal, treating heatiness and fever, but every 100 grams contain 5 grams of protein and 3 grams of fat, making them an excellent survival food. Rowland stored the dug-up irises in a cave, similar to how contestant Kaylin stored her fishing net. His net had not been successful, so he decided to move it to a deeper water area, hoping to quickly provide him with a protein-rich meal. On day 17, Mark was the fishing champion of the season. His fishing net caught 2 carp today. While other contestants worried about food, he had already secured his protein needs. So far, his net had brought in 26 fish, with 18 still stored. His shelter's smoking rack was too small, so he built a large triangular one outside. He lined it with spruce branches to contain the smoke and added an alarm system to prevent animals from stealing the fish at night. Eating high-fat fish daily, Mark developed diarrhea. He gathered reindeer moss nearby to balance his diet and improve his health. After eating the moss, he searched for berries and blueberries to help his stomach. By chance, he found a path made by a black bear and thought of hunting it. Next, he saw a bear in the berry field by the sea. Realizing bears visited whenever he left, he quickly returned with his bow and arrow to ambush in the berry field. Keith, in contrast, had only caught one trout with his fishing line. This morning, he faced a food shortage, but still made a tattoo needle from a bone. He mixed charcoal with racal to make ink and tattooed 25 dots near his ankle to connect with the land. He then crafted a fishing net, soaked it in racal juice to blend with the lake water, and set it in the shallows at night, hoping fish would swim into it while avoiding predators. On day 18, Crawley had finished eating the porcupine she caught 7 days ago and had nearly completed building her winter home. It was time to search for food. Her first snare trap caught nothing, but the second trapped a plump winter rabbit. She brought it back to her shelter, skinned it, and removed its organs, securing food for 2 more days. After solving her food needs, she found clay near her camp and decided to make more pots. She shaped the clay into coils, stuck them together, and successfully made 2 pottery jars by evening, useful for cooking or storing water. The scene shifts to Joel, who had just shot 2 rabbits in the forest. His action camera malfunctioned, but he still demonstrated the process professionally. When you see a rabbit, don't approach stealthily, as it will flee, seeing you as a predator. Instead, mimic a herbivore and approach slowly without making eye contact. Once in range, strike decisively to maximize the chance of hitting the rabbit. Joel cleaned the rabbits by the lake. He really got quite a bit of meat. Back at camp, he immediately stewed several rabbit legs and organs. He greatly enjoyed eating in front of the camera, finding the meat chewy and satisfying without being greasy. Its protein content is many times that of beef. After eating, it was time to work. He planned to make a door for the shelter by hammering 2 wooden stakes on either side of the wall. He then placed appropriately sized wooden bars between them to secure the door. Unexpectedly, a fly flew into Joel's ear while he worked. He never anticipated such an incident. He tried 3 or 4 methods but couldn't get the fly out. Finally, Joel took out an emergency medical kit and used a syringe to flush water into his ear, which finally dislodged the fly. He was relieved. The scene switches back to Keith. Since his fishing line and spear net had caught nothing, Keith turned to rock tripe as a last resort. Reportedly, George Washington's army survived the winter on this. Keith decided to follow in their footsteps. However, for him, used to eating fish, rock tripe was hard to swallow. It looked bouncy, but tasted like chewing mud. On day 21, Keith could no longer endure days of surviving on rock tripe and berries. After expressing his feelings to the camera, he took out a satellite phone to call the show's crew, asking for a pizza delivery. I thought he was quitting, but it turned out he was joking to entertain the audience. Later, Keith went to check his snare traps. After a long walk, he finally caught a squirrel. Having not seen meat for days, his eyes lit up. Back at camp, he quickly arranged to stew it in an iron pot. While eating, he even showed off his thighs to the camera. Perhaps the squirrel carried some bacteria, as Keith developed severe stomach cramps that night. By morning, trying to regain strength with squirrel soup only made his stomach churn again. Soon he couldn't even drink water. If this continued, his life was at risk. Realizing the severity, Keith hurriedly called the show's crew to quit. When the staff arrived, he was still vomiting. Roland wasn't doing much better. Today, checking his spear net moved to deeper waters, he was finally rewarded. He found 2 fish tangled in the net, a lake trout and a whitefish, each weighing 3 to 4 pounds. For once, he could see the possibility of reaching day 100. However, trouble arrived that night as the weather changed, and huge waves hit. Roland risked going down the steep cliffs to retrieve his spear net to prevent it from being washed away. He wanted to reset the net, but looking at the unrelenting wind and waves, as well as the steep cliffs, he decided against taking the risk. The scene shifts to Joe. By day 12, he had constructed the framework of a wooden hut, but by day 13, it mostly remained unchanged. It's unclear whether this is due to the editing by the show's crew, or if he simply hasn't been doing much recently. Either way, he now lacks food and is still living under a tent supported by a few pieces of wood. This morning, he checked his traps and had mixed news. 2 snares had caught rabbits, but carnivores had gotten to them first, eating parts of both rabbits. The loss was minor and still acceptable. Since Joel currently isn't short on food, he shifted some of his focus to passing time. He first tied 2 extended lock poles on a tripod to create a backrest and a platform, crafting a makeshift wilderness chair. Then, using his hunting knife, he carved a few wooden pieces, dipped them in berry juice to make dice. Lastly, He trimmed a piece of birch wood, carved a large hole at the end, and added 3 pins to each side, securing them with wire to create his own kakuyuri. The scene returns to Roland, who is now sitting at his camp, enjoying a stewed large fish in an iron pot, reminiscing about his late mother. Today, as the lake surface gradually calmed, he returned his spear net to its original position. Just as he was about to go berry picking nearby, he suddenly spotted a black bear on a hillside 200 meters away. With a side wind blowing, he took up his bow and arrow, entering a hunting mode. He tracked the bear until 4:30 p.m., but lost it, wasting 2.5 hours. The scene switches to Kaylin, who, having just finished washing up, found washing her hair too troublesome and cut off her braids with a hunting knife, giving herself a new hairstyle. After tidying up, she took her bow and arrow to check her traps. The snares were moved but had not caught any game. Fortunately, this proved that there were indeed animals in the area. Kaylin searched unhurriedly. Squirrels, alarmed by her presence, ran off from a distance. After some time, she heard rustling in the bushes. Focusing for 3 seconds, she spotted a rabbit and released an arrow, striking the rabbit's throat precisely. It was another fruitful day. She planned to prepare the rabbit for dinner, but the poor smoke ventilation in her hut drove her outside. The next morning, she made a hole in the roof, surrounded it with clay, and found that starting a fire improved the smoke ventilation. She planned to further refine this. Another female contestant, Crawley, was also making improvements to her shelter. She wanted to build a fully enclosed melon guard hut. She gathered many stones from around her camp to construct a half-person tall fireplace, then sealed the gaps with clay. She piled wood on the upper half, sealing the gaps with moss, and created an entrance on the sheltered side, allowing Crawley to comfortably enjoy her food inside. On day 26, the tarp Joe used for his melon hut fluttered loudly in the wind, yet he still slept in late. I'm somewhat speechless about that. Today he wants to try fishing. Given his ambitious plans for a grand wooden house, he needs enough energy to continue building. After waiting for 2.5 hours, he finally felt a bite. The fish he pulled to shore was not small, big enough to eat for 2 days. Excited, Joe quickly grabbed the fish by the gills, fearing it might slip off the hook. This fish, weighing at least 5 kilos, might be commonplace for the expert fisherman Mark, but for Joe, it's a significant asset. This trout from the lake will fuel the ongoing construction of his house. Amos, the Indian contestant. Today, Amos found his fishing net empty, an unusual occurrence. With the weather getting colder, he planned to chop more firewood but realized his axe was missing. Using a headlamp, he searched in the falling snow. If the snow covered the axe, it would be like finding a needle in a haystack. As expected, Amos didn't find the axe and ended up with frozen hands and wet footwear. The next morning, a thin layer of snow revealed the handle of the lost axe, bringing him great joy. Without it, collecting firewood would have been difficult. Since Roland's spear net last caught 2 fish, there had been no activity, and he hadn't seen many animals either. On day 29, while digging for roots, Roland spotted a muskox nearby. Stealthily, he shot an arrow from 30 meters away, hitting the animal's hind leg. The thick-skinned muskox thought it was just a mosquito bite and considered moving on. Roland quietly followed. As evening approached with no sign of the muskox weakening, he decided to make a decisive move. Sensing danger, the muskox roared, but Roland charged with his hunting knife, quickly retreating after stabbing it. Seeing the animal's weak resistance, he rushed in for another strike. Roland's courage was undeniable. After these attacks, the muskox quickly fell and died. A successful hunt left Roland very happy. With only an hour and a half until dark, he didn't have enough time to process the whole animal. He ate some raw muskox heart to regain strength, removed the organs prone to bacteria, and took some parts back, leaving the rest hoping no other animals would find it. Roland slept until noon the next day. He returned with his bow and arrow to continue butchering the muskox. Worried about bears or wolverines stealing the meat overnight, he hurried along the path. Arriving, he was shocked to see the stomach on the rock completely eaten. Fortunately, the rest of the muskox was untouched. Roland then began the orderly task of butchering. He first removed the 2 large legs facing upwards and planned the 2 pounds of tenderloin cut for dinner. He also took 2 large slices of tenderloin with him. After nearly 3 hours of chopping and cutting, he managed to process the legs, shoulders, steaks, and lungs. However, Several hundred pounds of meat could not all be transported back today. Roland hid the meat at the top of the mountain, covered with ox hide and camouflaged with stones and branches. He would move it in batches to the shelter later. Switching to Indian contestant Amos, a black bear had visited his camp last night. This morning, he saw its droppings. Fearing the bear might enter the wooden house to steal smoked fish while he was away, he quickly made a stronger, more durable door. Then, he checked his spike net, which had caught fish almost daily until today. To his dismay, the net was swept away by the waves, almost his entire food supply gone. Now, he had to return to the shelter and weave a new one. Fortunately, he had brought parachute cord to the competition. It took him 2.5 hours to make a new spike net, which he placed back at the original spot by the lake. Over at Fisherman Mark's location, he had caught 7 or 8 fish and lake trout over the past few days. With no room in the shelter, he tied a horizontal beam in the tree and hung the fish in midair, hoping to keep them away from other predators. Like Amos, Mark's net was empty today. Considering the possibility that the fish had moved to warmer, deeper waters, he lowered his net by 3 meters. Then, he returned and used his socks as a towel to bathe himself with boiled water. The next day, he went to check the net and saw fresh black bear droppings on the way, feeling a bad omen. Sure enough, the net was empty again. Planning to take a fish from his food storage for dinner, he was stunned to find all the hanging fish eaten. Mark underestimated the black bear's intelligence, which had untied the rope to eat the fish. His previously stable survival situation became tense within 2 days, prompting him to plan to hunt the bear. He chose 3 adjacent trees, cut off the obstructive branches at the bottom, and constructed a triangular platform in midair overlooking a berry patch frequented by the bear. Meanwhile, Kaylin, having failed to catch fish for a while, devised a new plan. She had found a metal barrel by the lake yesterday and decided to build a raft centered around it this morning to fish in deeper waters. She chopped down several spruce trees nearby and made a catamaran-style raft, securing the barrel in the middle and placing logs at the front and back for extra buoyancy. With that, her boat was ready. Kaylin paddled towards the deep water sitting on a metal barrel. Although the raft floated, its balance was poor. Slight movements nearly tipped her into the lake, forcing her to quickly paddle back to shore. Falling into the icy water could have meant withdrawal from the competition. Compared to other contestants, Joe truly earned the title of King of Laziness in Season 7. From day 12, when he built the wooden frame, to day 32, it remained unchanged. Joe planned to spend a day building a shelter, but ended up cutting down 1 tree, fitting it into place, then lying down again. Soon, he found several holes in the tarp above him as it rained heavily outside and drizzled inside. The rain lasted until the next morning. Joe intermittently wiped the leaking water with animal fur, almost breaking down. By dawn, his sleeping bag was slightly wet and needed to be hung to dry. Seeing the effort required, he thought the competition might end before he finished his shelter. He then tied the tarp to the frame, declaring the shelter complete, thinking himself a genius. Back to Roland, he sat in his stone shelter preparing to eat boiled ox heart for lunch before transporting the remaining meat. Approaching the destination, he noticed many black bear tracks and found the fat-rich ox tongue and brain eaten. Fortunately, the meat hidden on the mountain was undiscovered. Roland carried a 50 to 60-pound ox leg back to his shelter 3 kilometers away. Unable to move all the meat today, it had to stay out another night. Previously, Amos had woven a spike net. On the 35th day of survival, coinciding with his daughter's 2nd birthday, perhaps blessed by her, he caught a northern pike big enough for 2 days' meals. Returning to Roland, transporting the musk ox was finally nearing completion. Roland neared his destination and suddenly noticed many fresh black bear tracks on the ground, making him tense. Looking around, he spotted the black bear that had been stealing muskox meat just ahead. He immediately went into hunting mode. On day 35 of survival, Mark, having suffered from the bear's theft and multiple failures with his spike net, was forced to dig into the snow to track animals. He hoped to set several snare traps for a rabbit feast. However, during his journey, he spotted fox tracks and territorial urine markings in the snow, realizing that having competitors was not good news. The scene shifts to Roland, who was sitting in his dimly lit stone hut, stewing a mix of beef offal. Soon, a half-pound of sirloin on the fire was cooked to a crisp on the outside and tender inside. After a short rest, Roland planned to build a food storage room. First, he needed to treat his leather gloves with black bear brain matter for maintenance, and also apply some on his hands and face for protection. He then grabbed an axe and furiously chopped at the surrounding spruce trees. If he wanted to prevent bears and wolves from stealing, the storage had to be secure. Roland stacked the chopped wood into a square using a birch egg structure, drove a pair of stakes at each corner, and secured them with wire. He placed the processed musk ox and bear meat inside, separating each layer with spruce branches, and covered the top with logs. He placed 2 logs longitudinally under the wire at the bottom of the stakes as a door bolt, making it nearly impossible for bears or wolves to break in. Turning to craftsman Joel, who had previously made a cocoa yurt, he planned to make a wooden bowl today to eat and drink simultaneously. However, just felling one tree and moving it back to camp exhausted him. Although he had 10 days' worth of fish meat stored, it was calculated at half his normal meal size. Therefore, Joel was in a semi-starved state during this period. It took him half an hour to chisel out the shape of the wooden bowl. He then placed some charcoal inside to burn the inner walls, making them smooth. The wooden bowl was completed. There was a noise from the food storage area. With uncertainty, he went out to check and indeed saw a wolverine circling below. He scared it off with a shout, thinking it had not yet succeeded in stealing. Only when he climbed the ladder to the treetop storage with his headlamp did he realize the wolverine had already managed to take some fish, as he saw scattered fish pieces on the ground. His treetop food storage was not secure at all. After a careful recount, he found the wolverine had stolen 10 chunks of fish. What was supposed to last 10 days would now barely last 4 days. Back to Mark. He went to check the traps he had set a few days ago early in the morning. On the way, he found a small patch of reindeer moss and collected it to add some vitamins and change from the daily monotony of eating fish. Reaching the first trap, he was surprised to find a fox caught in the noose. While the fox could have provided food for several days, it was a protected local species, so Mark had to release it. He also had to be cautious not to get bitten since the fox could carry rabies, which would mean automatic disqualification from the competition. Fortunately, the fox seemed to understand Mark did not want to harm it and did not resist much. As soon as Mark let go, the fox dashed back into the forest. Though he lost the fox, Mark found a snow hare in the remaining traps, and his fishing net unexpectedly caught a 2.5-pound pike. Overall, it was a bountiful day for him. Joel, having lost some fish, decided it was safer to store the remaining pieces inside his wooden cabin. He dug a 30-centimeter deep hole in a corner, surrounded it with wooden stakes, and filled the gaps with spruce branches. He then built a thick and tight base of snow, placed the fish pieces separated by branches, and finally covered it with a metal plate and stones on top, creating a makeshift wild fridge. After a short rest, Joel went outside to prepare firewood. Suffering from lack of carbs and fats, he experienced ketoacidosis, making him weak and heavy-legged. While sawing wood, he collapsed, fainting. It took a long time before he could stand again. After a night of deliberation, Joel decided to withdraw from the competition the next day, as his body was too weak to respond to his brain's commands, and he felt it wasn't worth risking his life. On day 39, a weasel entered Crawley's shelter. Considering its small size and feeling lonely, Crawley did not offer it food, but allowed it to leave the hut unharmed. She then went to check her traps and caught a snow hare in the first one, followed by 4 more snow hares from other traps set up. Could it be related to releasing the weasel? These 4 snow hares provided Crawley with 650 grams of protein and 70 grams of fat. Delighted, she couldn't help but sing praises to the land. On day 40, a blizzard forced Mark to stay inside his cabin. As usual, he took out his son's photo and talked to the camera about his longing. With some spare time, he carved a wooden plaque until evening, making a piece depicting a horse. Unexpectedly, a spark ignited the cabin. Mark quickly took his camera outside as the strong wind fueled the fire. He pulled out burning logs and threw them onto open ground. After extinguishing the fire, much of the wall was destroyed. He waited until dawn to start repairs, covering the damaged wall with a non-flammable tarp and planning to replace the burnt wood later. Arriving at Joe's place, he slept until noon. Afterwards, he spent half an hour groggily facing the camera before working on logs for building walls. He worked for 15 minutes and then took a break. He rested for 3 hours in his well-ventilated and well-lit shelter, waking up at 4 p.m. to check his traps. It seems this lazy guy is blessed with lazy luck. His lasso traps caught 4 snow hares in one day. He immediately stewed the meat upon returning and enjoyed a hearty meal before sleeping again. It's hard to comment on this contestant named Joe. He's been working on his shelter for a month, and it's still not half done. He's never used the provided fishing nets, relying solely on lasso traps for catching hares. The accumulated hare skins are piling up. As the lightest and least skilled contestant this season, he has managed to survive on an endless supply of rabbit meat. Moving to Indian Elder Amos, his situation is similar to Mark's. Initially, he thrived on fishing with nets, but as temperatures dropped, his luck changed. Now he's setting lasso traps in the forest. The animal tracks in the snow are clearly visible, making tracking easier for Amos. He set traps along a path frequented by snowshoe hares. On his way back, next to his shelter, he saw fox tracks and made a long spear that evening, preparing for any predator's intrusion. Meanwhile, a fox appeared on the shelter's outdoor camera. Soon after, Amos heard the cries of a snow hare, indicating it was caught in a trap. To prevent other predators from reaching it first, he quickly grabbed his newly made spear. Hearing Amos, the fox turned around and fled. Fortuitously, Amos was there first to dispatch the hare with a stick. The quick success of the trap was unexpected. At dawn, he took the hare to the lake, skinned it, and removed the organs, leaving 2 pounds of meat. After eating fish for a month, he was finally able to enjoy a different taste. As Amos returned to the camp, a fox, attracted by the scent, appeared on the beach. Unusually fearless, the fox came within 3 meters of Amos, ignoring his attempts to drive it away, and boldly followed the trail to where the hare was cleaned. After eating the discarded organs, the fox approached Amos again. This behavior was not just provocative, but outright disrespectful. Amos shot a blunt arrow at it, which wouldn't be lethal, but was enough to make it flee in pain. Now it's Kaylin's turn. Having never been away from her husband for so long, she deeply misses his embrace. After reflecting on this, she went to check her traps. On the way, she spotted footprints, which gave her a bad feeling. Sure enough, when Kaylin reached the traps, she found only remnants of hare fur and organs. Another trap was even worse, with only a few tufts of hair left. This situation deeply upset her, making her miss her husband even more. Fortunately, she still had some stored snow hare left to eat. Continuing with Joe, he was unsettled after hearing wolves howling during dinner, as he was the only contestant without a bow and arrow, leaving him to face the wolves with only an axe. By the next morning, everything was calm again, and he was slowly processing logs. Today was especially praiseworthy, as he usually processes 1 log and rests until the next day, but this time he diligently made 3 or 4 logs, nearly finishing half a wall. Now looking at Mark, the once proud fish king is now in a state of neglect. It's been 3 days, and he hasn't finished his cabin. He feels increasingly tired, and his mental state is deteriorating, sometimes even arguing with himself. This morning, he still felt hungry after eating half a fish, and couldn't understand why he felt constant hunger despite eating continuously. On day 44, a production crew's yacht broke the silence, indicating a contestant had withdrawn. As the cameraman landed, the focus turned to Joe. It was surprising that Joe withdrew without finishing the 4 snow hares he had caught. Joe mentioned that life was tough and his physical state couldn't keep up with the work and survival demands. We wish him well on his journey. Kaylin, after some mental preparation, managed to adjust her state. Today, her luck with the traps improved. After losing 2 snow hares yesterday, nature gifted her 3 today, instantly clearing her gloom. Looking at the fat on the rabbit meat, she felt hopeful about lasting 100 days. On the afternoon of Joe's withdrawal, Mark, due to his poor physical and mental state, also called the production team to announce his withdrawal. By day 45, only 4 contestants remained. Roland, despite not worrying about food due to his successful hunting of musk deer, is concerned because the deer meat is very low in fat. He has lost 20 kilograms so far, and today scraped some fatty tissues from under the scalp, barely enough for 2 to 3 days fat intake. The situation for the other contestants is not optimistic either. Amos is down to 3 fish and nearing starvation. His fishing nets have been fruitless and have developed large holes over time. He plans to retrieve the nets and wait to use them once the lake freezes. On his way back, he saw wolf tracks outside his shelter, causing some panic. Now, he must economize, and hopes the 3 remaining fish will last until the lake freezes. The scene shifts to Crawley, who previously relied on lassoing and hunting for food, but now faces a lack of fat. This morning, she spent some effort making a spike net, planning to set it up at her usual fishing spot. Looking around, the rocks by the lake were icy. Crawley slipped and fell, not only cutting her eyebrow, but also accidentally biting her lip. Concerned that asking for help from the production team might lead to a forced withdrawal due to her injuries, she used a mirror and gauze from the first aid kit to clean the blood off her face and return to the survival challenge. Crawley's resilience is admirable, surpassing many men. The spike net and fishing line can no longer be used as the lake begins to freeze. At this time, Roland and Crawley thought of the same spot. He set up the spike net where he initially caught 2 fish, hoping for continued success. Suddenly, Roland turned to see a sight that left him stunned. A large herd of musk deer frolicking on the hillside. In the past, he would have been ready with his bow and arrow, but now he doesn't need the deer meat, and catching a group of animals is more difficult and dangerous. Roland simply watched them leave. The next day, the weather worsened. Roland also slipped while checking traps, hitting his knee hard on a rock. Fortunately, he had no old injuries. Otherwise, a recurrence like Corey's, leading to withdrawal, would have been too great a loss. Today, the lake waves were fierce, tangling the spike net and risking it being washed away. Roland considered retrieving it, but feared falling into the lake. Instead, he used a 6-meter log to make a pole and managed to retrieve the spike net with great difficulty. Turning to Kaylin, her lasso trap caught a ptarmigan, similar to a snow hare and mostly lean meat, providing little fat. She also wanted to fish from the lake, but weeks of fishing from the shore yielded nothing. She had to wait for the lake to freeze over to fish in deeper waters through the ice. On the 48th day of survival, the lake in Kaylin's area finally froze. However, according to her experience, the ice was not yet thick enough to support her weight. After waiting another day, the ice was sufficiently thick. She went to the deep water area, drilled a small hole about 30 centimeters square, laid a layer of spruce branches for a seat, and began her ice fishing venture. After a tough 2.5 hours, Kaylin finally caught a lake trout, her first fish since the competition began. Her mood was comparable to that of a successful candidate in an imperial examination. Not knowing how much time had passed, she caught another lake trout, larger than the first. Kaylin felt that if things continued this way, she might be able to last 100 days and win the prize money. Looking back, Amos had planned to go out and set several traps, but as soon as he stepped outside, he was frightened by the sight of a wolf pack surrounding his shelter. He counted 7 or 8 wolves, likely attracted by the fresh fish he had hung at the door. Fortunately, the wolves lingered for a few minutes and left without attacking Amos, but the scare was significant for him. On the 51st day, leader Roland discovered a new food source. Recently, he noticed a squirrel on a tree in front of his door that wouldn't leave. This morning, he saw it climbing down with a mushroom in its mouth and realized it had stored many mushrooms in the tree. Roland chopped down the tree with an axe, seizing the squirrel's entire winter stash and storing the mushrooms in a leather pouch he made, filling half a bag. Turning to strongwoman Crawley, the overnight heavy snow buried half of her lasso, making catching snow hares particularly difficult. She had to raise the lasso a few centimeters by feel to prevent it from being buried again. Previously, Crawley had tracked a porcupine den but never found it at home during her visits. Today, she planned to check again. Porcupines have fat-rich bodies, and the last one she caught lasted her a week. Catching this one could solve her current difficulties. She saw fresh bite marks on nearby trees, indicating the porcupine was still alive. Crawley set a lasso trap on its path, planning to return later to check it. After catching 2 fish, Kaylin's confidence soared. Today, she flexed her muscles for the camera and continued ice fishing. After waiting 3 hours, she caught a whitefish, but unfortunately, it escaped when she retrieved it too quickly. Kaylin was so frustrated that she jumped 3 meters high. Only this fish took the bait today, making her wonder if her beginner's luck had worn off. Amos still had half a salmon left. Seeing that the lake was slow to freeze, he polished some metal into shiny pieces, planning to try his luck by the lake tomorrow. A few days ago, Crawley set a trap at the porcupine den. This morning she went to check, expecting success, but found the trap pushed aside. She decided to risk crawling into the den. If she got stuck in the narrow crevice, she could freeze to death. Fortunately, She saw what she wanted. The porcupine was hiding deep within. Crawley drove it toward the back entrance, and then returned to the front to shoot it with an arrow. The porcupine died without knowing it would be trapped and shot in its own home. Crawley got what she wanted. The porcupine, weighing over 20 pounds, would completely turn her situation around, just as she had hoped. The porcupine, fatty as expected, was prepared for a feast. Unexpectedly, the liver was spotted with white, a sign of tularemia, posing a risk of infection if consumed. Faced with the dilemma, Crawley had to decide whether to eat the diseased animal to sustain herself or risk continuing without it. Day 54. Challenge Amos took his fishing gear to the lakeside, knowing that the fish were in the deep water. He decided to try his luck anyway. Surprisingly, he got a bite within an hour, but like Kaylin, the fish escaped halfway through. No more bites came before nightfall. Kaylin still had 2 fish left from the day before yesterday, and didn't plan to go out for food today. She stayed inside her shelter to rest. While a fish stew simmered on the stove, she rubbed her feet clean. By the time her feet were clean, the fish was cooked. Kaylin savored the fish. She even licked her fingers clean after eating. Though she planned to rest, the ventilation pipe got blocked by snow, trapping smoke inside the shelter. This caused her much distress, with tears and a runny nose. She had been trying to improve her smoked meat techniques, suspecting that the local air pressure was affecting the smoking quality. By the next morning, Kaylin broke down emotionally. As the challenge progressed, the mental state of the participants became very sensitive. Sometimes, a small incident could be the last straw. Feeling close to his limit, he went back to the forest to retrieve his set lasso traps, preparing to possibly quit the competition. Back to Amos, he had been without food for nearly 3 days. With no ice forming on the lake and feeling his body fat depleting, the fire was his only source of warmth. Eventually, he made the call to withdraw from the challenge. By day 64, the snow on the ground was increasing by 10 centimeters daily. Crawley's lasso traps were still unsuccessful, and she had to reset them daily to prevent them from being buried. With little rabbit meat left, she considered eating the meat of porcupines known to carry tularemia. After a good cry, Kaylin released her emotions and decided to keep going. She dug a pit under the cabin to serve as a fireplace, which effectively improved the smoke ventilation. After fishing at the lake for 2.5 hours the next morning, she caught a fish. Her excitement was indescribable. It was enough food for several days. She took it back, cut it into several pieces, and alternated between meals to make it last for about a week. After eating, she took out the snowshoe frames she had made and spent half an hour tying umbrella cords in various directions, crafting the shoe uppers. Her handiwork was quite impressive. Roland's days also became tougher. With the last few months expected to be the most challenging, he wanted to gather rose hips while they were still available. Unexpectedly, he found a porcupine eating the rose hips. Seeing the opportunity for a substantial meal, and considering the slow speed of the porcupine, Roland killed it with a stick. The porcupine was exceptionally fatty, providing much-needed fat for the winter. Type 72. Survival Challenge. Roland finished gnawing on the bones in his shelter, then started a bonfire outside. He roasted the porcupine over the fire to burn off the spiny hair, keeping the skin intact to preserve all the fat. That evening, Roland feasted on a large shank. Over the last 7 days, Crawley had lost 20 pounds and urgently needed to consume fat to maintain her weight. After much thought, she decided to go for the porcupine meat. Since she had already been exposed to a potentially infectious environment while processing the animal and hadn't fallen ill, she believed it was preventable. Crawley stewed the meat over the fire, turning it frequently to ensure it was thoroughly cooked. When she finally tasted the fat, it was like a dry sponge soaking up water. She had been craving this meal for days. After eating her fill, she felt revitalized. Crawley also collected enough wood to keep the fire going at night. While gathering, she felt a sharp pain in her right shoulder and discovered a porcupine quill had embedded itself in her flesh. It was not a trivial matter as it could cause internal damage if not removed. Fortunately, the emergency kit provided by the show included tweezers, which Crawley used to remove the quill. By day 75, Roland wanted to eat the last piece of brisket bone, but found that mice had nibbled away the fat on it. Now that fat was more valuable than protein, he quickly checked his stash of porcupine fat and buffalo bones. He was furious to find that the bones had been cleaned by the mice. He threw the remaining parts into a bag made from buffalo hide and hung it from the smoky ceiling to deter further theft. Kaylin managed to survive another week by fishing in the lake. After finishing her fish head soup, she returned to the frozen lake to fish again. After 2 hours of waiting, she was about to haul in a fresh catch when it slipped off the hook. Frustrated, she broke down crying on the ice, overwhelmed by thoughts of giving up. By day 80, unable to bear the hunger any longer, Kaylin chose to leave the competition. By then, temperatures in the area had dropped below 30 degrees Celsius. Roland wore a wool coat and black bear gloves to stay warm. Finally, the lake in front of his stone shelter froze solid, and he decided to try ice fishing to replenish his fat stores. He took careful precautions against falling through thin ice by carrying a long pole. After using an axe to make a rectangular hole in the ice, he waited 3 hours with no luck. Roland knew it wasn't his day. Meanwhile, Crawley also tried ice fishing, using rabbit fur and porcupine innards as bait. She couldn't stand outside for 3 hours like Roland, as she had recently discovered frostbite on her right big toe, which had turned purple. Further deterioration could lead to irreversible damage, or even amputation. Roland, who had collected berries in the first 3 months, now eats the last of them, saved for today. To his dismay, the berries stored under moss on the warm ceiling have molded and spoiled. Roland then turns to a corner, where a cow stomach filled with undigested grass lies. Despite its taste, the nutrition is high. He boils it into a mushy meal. Cut to Crawley, her face always smiling. The porcupine she has been eating is nearly gone. Today, hoping for a snow hare, she checks her snares. Her smile seems to bring luck. She catches a hare, securing food for the next 2 days. Crawley cleans the hare at her shelter, fries it in porcupine fat, and enjoys the exceptionally tasty, high-protein meal. Meanwhile, Roland is on the lake ready to break the ice for water when a blizzard suddenly hits. The visible tree line blurs into white. Needing water, he follows his footprints back to shore before they're covered by fresh snow. Crawley, undeterred, continues ice fishing but isn't as lucky as Kaylin. She doesn't catch a single fish. Her frostbitten toes force her back to the fire periodically. After the hare and porcupine are gone, she resorts to boiling bones for soup, which quickly becomes no different from plain water. By day 89, Crawley receives a message from the show's crew to stay in her shelter for a medical check. Soon, a helicopter lands and a doctor arrives to assess her frostbite, which is progressing towards irreversible damage in a nutritionally poor environment. Following the show's rules, they terminate Crawley's challenge. She had maintained a great attitude throughout. Without the frostbite, she likely could have lasted 100 days. Now, only Roland remains. Tonight, Roland's meal is a bison hoof. Facing the last of the muskox meat, he ensures every part is utilized. The cooked hoof looks unappetizing and tastes like chewing a shoe sole, but it is nutritionally substantial. On day 92, Roland tries ice fishing again, but with the same luck as before. For the final days, he decides not to struggle anymore. He chops wood and splits firewood by day, spending nights by the fire, reflecting on his family and late mother. Finally reaching day 100, Roland carves the last mark on his calendar tree. The show's crew brings his sister Megan, and they embrace excitedly to celebrate his victory. Roland brings out a bone marrow he had been reluctant to eat, calling it butter found in the wild. Ultimately, Roland's exceptional courage and perseverance earn him the championship.